May I welcome you to our discussion time. We've had a very full day. In England, this is known as the graveyard slot. If you're ever invited to speak, never choose this slot, because most people have either disappeared or else they're fast asleep. But I hope that we will be able to wake everyone up, because I think the issues we have been addressing today are critical and they need more exploration. And I know that some of you have been dying to ask questions. Well, we've got 5 of our panelists here. I think you all know the first 4, but the end. I haven't got your biodata, but could you just introduce yourself, because you'll be speaking tomorrow.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tesula Hajitofi. I'm originally born in Cyprus, and I live in the Netherlands. I'm a cultural activist, and I have spent 35 years of my life to combat art trafficking, start civil and criminal cases worldwide, to repatriate looted antiquities. Recently, I made an MOU with University College London, where we are going to set up a research and training center in Cyprus as a daughter of our Walk of Truth NGO in the Netherlands. It's a charity where we take all the case studies that we have to give training to countries in war for protecting and promoting cultural heritage. I'm glad I'm here with you today.
Thank you. And she'll be speaking to us tomorrow. This conference is really a process. It's the start of a process. It's not a culmination. When we planned it, we wanted to put Artsakh firmly on the map, the history of suffering and persecution of Armenians, but also the future challenges we're likely to face. Turkey continues to add pressure. Issues around Azerbaijan is not over, and so we have to be thinking of the way ahead. And so the discussion today, I hope, will give us pointers as to the future, what you would like to see us do. There will be a committee meeting after this conference to take whatever we agree on further to next stages. So over to you now. Based on what you've heard so far, any questions? Now, we don't have a roving microphone. Do we have a roving microphone? If not, could you stand up, just give your name and organization at church and a question. Do they come here? Yes. There you've got it. Could you then head towards who would ever like to ask a question? I chose Lavon.
Yes.
Lavon.
I had lots of questions in my mind, but I'll try to make summarize. As a pastor, it's very difficult to make it short, but I'll try to. I have lots of questions, and I lived here for 30 years, moved from the States, born in Syria, because in Syria I didn't find my identity. I was 16 when the policeman gave me a spank and called me piece of Armenian. So I left Syria when I was 24, because that was not my country. I lived in the States 13 years, again, that was not my country. I came to Armenia knowing this is my country, and still we have challenges. So we have identity crisis wherever we live. And in these 30 years, one of the major questions I have about the genocide, repeatedly it was coming during the talk, that happened first 20th century, first crime. But I don't see difference between 1915 and what happened in the war in Artsakh. I mean, at that time I used to say, where were the international communities 100 years ago? But today, world is advanced with many technologies, with techniques, with internet. I mean, you see what's happened on the spot. So where was the international community West or East, I don't know what you name it or want to call it, who were human activists in bringing social justice in the cases like this, putting the religious side on the side for a moment. But where were the Christian countries that they should have laid hand, if there are any, in the world context today? So all of you that you are active, it's a general question, but if there is a simple, specific answer, because we saw repetition of the genocide in front of our eyes. I've been living here 30 years, I didn't feel secure in the homeland. Anybody wants to comment, it's open.
Thank you so much, Reverend. May I ask two people to address it initially? One from a non-Armenian perspective and one from an Armenian perspective. Either John or Baroness Cox. Who would like to go? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Such an important question, and I really have sort of two answers to it. One is the impunity with which Azerbaijan is able to continue its atrocities, and continue now, not just during the war. And I wrote a publication called Continuing Impunity, Azerbaijan-Turkish Offensives Against the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it documents a lot of the appalling atrocities, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so on. It's a follow-on from a book which Dr. Eibner here and I co-authored. He did all the hard work, actually. But, and that was called Ethnic Cleansing in Progress, the War in Nagorno-Karabakh. And that was way back in the early 1990s, and we were there during that war. And so the question the first question I'd like to raise or to put forward for discussion is what on earth can we do to stop the impunity which Azerbaijan and Turkey are perpetuating their atrocities. And the second is very briefly an answer for the British government, if I may, because I'm very critical of the British government. It does nothing in response to the current situation, or indeed the last situation. And just one, I think, an answer to your question, and this is not breaking confidence, because I've quoted it in the House of Lords, but in the previous war, I took photographs of children who were shredded by cluster bombs. And I went to a very senior person in the Foreign Office, and I showed him these pictures, and I said, will the British government make representation of the government of Azerbaijan to stop dropping cluster bombs on civilians? It's against international law. The answer, no country has an interest in other countries, only interests. We have oil interests in Azerbaijan, good morning. That was it. And I'm afraid that is still the British government's position, but probably speaks in a broader perspective that where there are interests, economic interests or strategic interests, you find it very hard to get governments to take sides with the victim.
I'd like just to continue that line for a moment, and maybe John might be able to help us. During the war and after the war, from the UK position, we struggled to get organizations to speak out. The media was pro-Azeri. The Christian agencies either pro-Azeri. I can think of an article in Christianity Today that took the Azeri position. We had our backs to the wall. John or Caroline, why did the Christian agencies, or secular ones, did not come out clearly on this issue?
Well, there isn't just a simple answer to the question, but it also has to do with, interests. I think I know the article that you're referring to, and if I remember, the person that was cited as calling on Christians not to support the Armenians, is very much involved in political life in the States, and will want to represent, at that time, the State Department interest or a political interest. And sadly, with many NGOs, they really shouldn't be called NGOs because they're financially dependent on governments in one way or another. I can't speak for HEART, I'm not, but I can certainly speak for CSI. We do not receive money from any government, and if it were to come, I would say, as the president of CSI, we don't take it, even though it might be very helpful in a particular case. We need to be free to speak out. We're dealing with a very interesting and important question that does touch on Armenians in Syria, and that has to do with with sanctions. We're involved in conversations with a host of NGOs in Geneva, and it's very interesting to see the politics behind it. Who's free to speak? Who doesn't want to speak? Who can't speak without huge financial loss? So we get tied up in these kinds of situations and end up, the Christian world, the secular human rights world, ends up being paralyzed. And every state, powerful state, be it the United States, Britain, Russia, every state will want to try to control politically sensitive narratives. And they have many, many means of doing so in the media, through NGOs. I personally was not in favor, and I told the Bishop of Truro's team that I was not in favor of the establishment of the religious liberty institutions that have been set up in the UK, not because I don't like religious liberty, but I've seen in the States, and I was all in favor of them in the States, I've seen that they have been, in many cases, counterproductive. I haven't seen what they have achieved. Here and there, I'm sure they've achieved something, but they have been able to manage the narrative, so the narrative becomes controlled actually by state interest and not by civil society itself.
Thank you. From an Armenian perspective, can we have the two from Armenia, one of course from Cyprus, or would you be able to put the question, why was there not more of an Armenian response, particularly from the diaspora, to this question, the failure of organizations to address? But both of you, I'd like both of you.
I think I'm the only Armenian on the panel, but I would appreciate if the question was asked specifically so I know exactly what to answer.
The question had to do with a failure of responses to the last war, and historically there has been a systematic failure to address. In fact, I quoted Pope Francis this morning mentioning that. We've looked at the failure from the non-Armenian, but the Armenians too, you could argue, in the diaspora was not as outspoken as they should. Is there a reason why?
I would actually disagree. I think that from the perspective of the Armenian diaspora, I never saw the diaspora come together as much as, but I'm 41 years old, and yeah. I guess my sort of intellectual life started at 12. So from what I've seen, yes. The diaspora came together enormously, and I mean, to the point where I literally moved my life to now be based here, yes. While I still work for the UN. The international lack of responsiveness was, I think it boils down to two things. There was a pandemic and there was a Trump election. Yes. The world was distracted. But yeah, there was not enough. What response were we waiting for? It was during a global pandemic, and there was this election. The timing of the attack was very carefully planned. But I think that the Armenian diaspora was very much active, involved, and trying to get as much attention that they could on the war. And I mean, honestly, cultural heritage has never been my specific area of expertise, even though it does form part of like the war crime portfolio. I was really trying to work more on the we were getting these videos of soldiers getting beheaded. I couldn't believe that the world could watch this and not intervene more. But there was, in parallel, this enormous effort on trying to preserve the cultural properties that were being lost, that was being done through not only the diaspora, but the international community in a way that it actually took me by surprise. And I thought, oh, well, I guess people do care about our religious and cultural property more than I even expected or thought.
Thank you. Any thoughts from Cyprus?
Well, I think that is twofold. One, we are dealing with two powerful countries, Turkey and its role in NATO, and Azerbaijan that is positioned in oil. And actually, coming from Cyprus, I recently went to my town, and Erdogan, I met there Azeris, and they said, I said, welcome to my town. I can come here 47 years. And they said, oh, well, it's part of the broader mother Turkey, and we are going to come and invest here. So you are dealing with very powerful countries. Second, I think that the destruction of cultural heritage has never been understood by politicians and policy makers how essential it is to the ordinary citizens. We are here talking about peace. This conference is all about peace, but you cannot have peace without justice, or you cannot have sustainable peace without trust. How on earth can you build trust when you disrespect my ancestors with graveyards, or you disrespect my faith and you destroy my monuments? Once we understand that, then we will attend to human life loss as a priority when there's war, but equally so the destruction of cultural heritage, especially religious monuments, which scar you for life. And as of you, my friend, welcome to the club. I'm Cypriot, I'm Dutch, I juggle both, but you can develop another identity, and you can belong to a group of people who share your own values, and everybody here is. So mobilize yourself with us to take action, and you'll find a broader family, and you'll be less upset.
Well, there you've got your answer, Lavan. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Father, could I come
Thank
in?
you.
Could I come in on something?
Yes, please, Archbishop. Yes.
I think I agree with you. Nothing has changed. In fact, we've regressed. I remember one particular evening in 2015 where I went to attend an event that marked the centenary of the Armenian genocide, and then drove across London to attend a memorial service for our Ethiopian brothers who had just been killed in Libya on the same night. 100 years between them. In actual fact, considering we're in the 21st century, with international treaties and development and knowledge, we've regressed. And I think part of that, I mean, you spoke of the media being everything is immediate. In actual fact, I think that works against us, not for us, in two ways. The first is that I see media agencies, whether mainstream or online media, as now directing opinion rather than reporting. There are very few, if any, media agencies that actually don't have an agenda or an affiliation. And because social media is so quick, mainstream media is trying to catch up. So they will follow the lead without substantiating. And so once you have a narrative, the narrative is driven forward. The second point is that because of the speed of news feeds, I always say that there was once upon a time where you would have a newspaper sitting on your coffee table for a week. Then it became daily. Then you had morning and evening editions, and now things fly off the top of your news feed every few seconds. And once they fly off the top of your news feed, they're replaced by something else. So our attention is directed by the media, and unless we keep doing things like this, where we remain focused, we will continue to be directed by this thing that is called social media, and that may or may not have interest. So I think it's very important for us to not be driven, but to be able to calm down, look at the agenda, and drive one forward rather than be driven by other aspects.
Yes. His Eminence has raised a very important point on the role of the media. One of the positive aspects to come out of the conflict in terms of the media has been the development of two websites, one being operated from here under Father Garakin, and the other will be a global website being operated from the UK. Is Armene here? Armene? Do you think, Armane, you could just come up and just very briefly touch on this? Because I think what His Eminence has said is so critical. We felt that the media had actually, we could not influence the media. Therefore, we had to develop our own media, so to speak, both in terms of the website and social media. And Armane is the editor of the new website, which has just been launched with all the social media aspects to it. And we're hoping that we really are going to take the initiative on this. Armane, could you just describe what we've been doing?
So we are in the process of launching a website, the purpose of which I would say is not quite to influence the media, but to inform them and of the truth of what is happening in Armenia and particularly in Nagorno-Karabakh. And so I would agree that in addition to the media carrying a narrative in the sense of they're not reporting, they're telling people what they should believe. And I wouldn't say that's true of all media, because I think we should remember that Sarah Rainsford, the BBC's Moscow correspondent, has just been expelled from Moscow for asking a question about political activists in the treatment of political activists in Belarus. So this is not representative of all media, but I think there is the problem of actually what is the truth? How do we get to the truth, the message of the reporting? And also the other thing that comes to mind is the both sides approach to reporting, which I think is concerning, because both sides are not equally responsible for what has happened. There is a clear perpetrator of violence, and there is, the other side who does not necessarily want to engage in violence. So I think the both sides approach to media reporting needs to be addressed as well.
When do we launch the website? Have we just launched it, or is it yet to be launched?
Ever so slightly yet to be launched, but we can have a conversation about that afterwards.
So I'm just wondering if anyone can actually access it at this
It is live. You can access it. The website address is garabakh.org. Garabakh.group. I think that's right, isn't it? Group. And you can access it. All the information on the website is academically rigorous. So we have references and sources for everything. And we have asked academics who are specialists in the relevant areas to check that the text is accurate and represents the truth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, please, David.
Can I just add a very small point to this particular discussion? And it may already have been made, because my bad hearing, I won't necessarily hear everything. But one thing that we've learnt, and I'm sure you've learnt, is that the quickest news to get out into the media and the best laid out, best designed, will always come from the perpetrator, because of course they are the persons who know what is going to happen and when it's going to happen. And so a perpetrator will always manage to capture the media first of all, and of course once they've captured the media, very difficult to take over afterwards and to regain. Just a small point, but just wanted to throw it in.
I think it's not just a small point, it was a major one. Azerbaijan actually had laid the foundations in terms of the manipulation of the media before the war. And they were able to spend vast sums of money that went through Brussels that actually literally bought elements of the media. What was being done is what is known as PSYOPs, psychological warfare. and the Azeris and the Turks were very, very good at it. And they caught us really off guard. And so we have been having to fight a rear guard battle, firstly to catch up, and then secondly to get our narrative over. And thankfully, Armene, a very, very good group of brilliant people have begun now to address it, both in terms of what's happening here, in terms of the Armenian website, and what is going to be happening internationally. Any other questions at this point, or comments? John? Yeah.
There are many more primitive methods of communication that are underused, and one comes to mind, especially for Christians. I'm in many different churches, mainly Catholic or Protestant of one sort or another, and it's very rare that I hear a prayer for the persecuted and prayers of intercession. We speak about the media more times than not. Whatever is on CNN on Saturday night or in the Sunday morning newspapers is what is presented to the church people to pray about. And it's a very simple method of course, praying, but also informing. This issue is important. The message, if we don't include this in our worship life in a simple way like that, the message we're conveying to the people in the pews is, this is not important. So it's not high tech, it's simple, and I would encourage especially bishops who might be in a position to send out directives to their parishes to think in these terms about raising the profile of the plight of persecuted Christians in Karabakh and elsewhere.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those previous questions. I think this moves on in a sense from the previous question. It's wonderful that we've got this really ecumenical dimension here at this conference, and a lot of stress has been placed on that, and that's superb. In the two questions, sorry. In the, what was I going to say? I've gone blank. The Eastern and Oriental churches are very often underrepresented in Western discourse. And there's been a lot of silence from beyond the global church in terms of what's happened in Karabakh. There's, to a degree, a deafening silence from the churches in what's happening in Syria, and a deafness to the voices of Christians in Syria. So, and it may be a question to Archbishop Angelos in a way, but how can the churches or the Eastern churches have a stronger voice within the global Christian community? Because the importance of not just the Armenian church, but the Eastern and Oriental churches for global Christianity is absolutely vital. And the importance of what is going on in this whole region is essential to global Christianity. And yet global Christianity, to a large effect, is either silent or absent in its voice. So that's the first question. Second is not really related, and it's more to Armenians. I've often reflected in the last year or so that we don't hear about Armenia. Armenia doesn't sell itself. And Armenia has its history, it has its culture, it has its faith, its roots in the Christian faith. And yet you have, and I've been saying this to a few people, Georgia in TripAdvisor is within the top 10 destinations to visit in the world. It's getting its act together. It's selling itself as a cultural destination, as a religious destination. It's saying it's the birthplace of Christianity in the region. Well, actually Armenia might be. and it's selling its culture, its history, its nature. Armenia is a bit behind. And might that be another angle that Armenia can take in terms of really celebrating its history, its culture, its religion, its food, and standing up for its place within the global and geopolitical sphere. Thank you.
Much. We are very fortunate in the Oriental Orthodox churches. I'm Syriac, in that all of us recognize that we've got a very able leader to represent us in the Western world in the form of Archbishop Angelos. In the UK, he is held in the highest regards in the US and internationally. So I think your question is a very, very good one, and we're very, very thankful that we have the Archbishop representing our churches internationally. Archbishop Angelos, could you take it a bit further, the question that has been raised on the role, particularly of the Oriental Orthodox?
Thank you. It's very kind and very embarrassing at the same time, but I think what is important that I have learned is we need to speak to be heard rather than speak for the sake of speaking. And one of the things that I think we've been able to do in London through my own ministry and through our contacts is be bilingual. And I don't mean just linguistically, I mean bilingual in terms of understanding and communication. We need to teach people how to speak and teach people how to listen. So quite often when we have our churches represented from our own space where there's persecution, there is marginalization, there is alienation, we're frantic because of the passion we have, and we come across as frantic. And sometimes the Western ear shuts down at that. So we have to learn how to express ourselves in a way that is, and that's how Lord Jesus Christ acted. He spoke in parables, he spoke in different ways, he spoke to touch hearts. The second thing, however, is we must help our sisters and brothers in the West to listen and to cut out the fact of how things are being said and focus on what is being said and why. And we need to also in the West stop being prescriptive. You know, the number of times I was listening to, should Christians leave the Middle East, and people sit in the comfort of their own armchairs, sometimes in the West, and say, no, they should stay to maintain Christian presence, or they should leave. In actual fact, it's their decision. These churches, our Syriac Orthodox sisters and brothers, have been living in the region for 2,000 years, and they have that knowledge. We have that knowledge. We're often seen to be moved by governments and direct. In actual fact, it is survival. It is how to say, what to say, and when to say it for the interest of people there, because for us it's not an academic exercise. What we say impacts people there on the ground. So having our friends in the West listen to what is being said and, thank you, and to give credibility to people in situ for actually understanding and having the knowledge of their own regions and their own dynamics. And I think that's the best thing we can do. And I'm hoping out of this exercise, we do have people who start to listen slightly differently.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. Before we go further on this, particularly a second question, I think that tomorrow we have the Foreign Minister speaking. We're going to have a lot focusing on Armenia, whether that is an issue that can be picked up. Is that okay? If we can do that, David. Very quick comments then from Baroness Cox.
And I talk about the reality of Syria as I've seen it. They say, thank you so much. We knew there was more than what the BBC was saying. Thank you for showing us what's happening. And I think we have to get that truth out, which is not covered by the main media.
Could you have a very quick comment on this? Because I'd like us to move on to another area. Yes.
On the point that you made about the West has to understand us, I think we also, together, all of us have to, in affected communities, because we are upset, we tend to tell what happened to us and expect help. I think we have to develop alternative narratives. And these narratives, we have to study the problems of the other. And when we speak about our problems, to pitch it in a way they understand. For example, when they bring illegal settlers in an area to occupy, you have to explain and link it with integration and the problems in Europe, the identity issues, the religious freedoms. These are things that they understand, but they're not going to come to us if we say Turkey did this to us or Azerbaijan did this, why don't you come? They've got enough problems of their own. You understand?
I'd like us to move our discussion in slightly a different direction because we've got about 15 minutes or so. Could you just hold a minute, please, and then bring you on? What it is this. Part of my life has been, believe it or not, with this cloth, a military analyst. And I've served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, not as a clergyman, but purely as a military advisor. I was an analyst with NATO, the US, and UK. I have a concern. The more I try to grapple with the situation, what I see unfolding, I don't believe that the war is really over. I think it's being fought differently. I think Turkey is looking back to the old days of the Ottomans, linking now two things together. One is the Turkish nationalism, her identity, and linked the second with Qatar, the brotherhood, an Islamic agenda. And she sees the Caucasus and Central Asia as really her domain. And the problem is really what to do, initially with Armenia and then later Georgia. I think that the second issue that arises out of that is Azerbaijan and the linkages with countries like Pakistan and other militancy that is going to seek to nibble away at Armenia itself. And Armenia, in a weakened state, then becomes at risk down the road. So the question I have is, if that scenario is only partially correct, and we are faced with a new uncertainty ahead, what responses do you think can be made so that we are not caught out as happened in this last war? John, you've had experience in this whole field. Have you given this any thought as to what might be a possible response, John?
Well, I've given quite a lot of thought about what happens in the future here in this particular region. And I think that you're quite right about the war being fought in a different way. But I believe that the old great game is going to come to life again in a way that we didn't really see it in the Cold War. It's not something new. It's been going on. There'll be a struggle for this band of territory running from the Black Sea, Ukraine, to the west of China. And it's hard to foresee exactly how everybody is going to play the game. But obviously the United States has interest, Russia has interest, China has interest, Turkey has interest, Iran is here. Things are moving in Afghanistan, and I would expect ever more instability in this area that is going to complicate the issue of religious freedom and make this region even less secure for Christians. It seems to me that in this part of the world, Christians have only managed to have some kind of stability and security when there is a power that behaves responsibly and is able to establish a certain level of security, and life can go on a day-to-day basis in a fairly normal way, and not when there are great power competitions. For the area, and I'm afraid that the Christians will be the losers, as they were in Turkey in the 19th century when Britain actually went to war against Russia, and actually the plight of Christians, which was an issue, and people did discuss about it, but it had a secondary role, a second place.
Thank you for that. Can I bring in Danny? Danny, you've got very wide experience in these kinds of issues. Could you just give some comments on how you see things unfolding and what might be any possible responses? Could we have the mic, please, to here?
Well, it's a tough question at this time of night or afternoon. I'm not certain I share the analysis of how this all started, or the general assent of analysis of how this all started. This war began, in my estimation and analysis, because of an age-old situation which dictators and indeed actually elected democratic governments have responded to in the same way over centuries. Aliyev was in trouble at home. The economy was diving. People were getting very, very restless. And I think somebody walked in and said, "You need a war." And that isn't unusual in these circumstances. It may not be said in that blunt way, but that's what happens. We've had it even, frankly, in the United Kingdom in the last century. So I think that's where this started. And I'm a great believer that if you don't get the first domino to fall in the right way, the others don't fall either in the right way. So I think the analysis has to start with, how did this begin? I think that's how it began. So, you have a greedy man who is, in a sense, in hock to his Turkish neighbor, and in hock to some wider influences in the area. And people simply have taken advantage of that. We're back to a phrase that's been used time and time again today. We're back to interests. And people have said, okay, here's the situation. This is how we can manipulate that situation for our own national benefit. So where do we go then from here? Oil does not last forever anywhere. So I think we have to have a short, a medium, and a long-term strategy. I don't actually see the NATO alliance as we see it defined today staying together as it is now. I think perhaps in 10 or 15 years' time, perhaps earlier, there will be a split between Turkey and the rest of NATO. Azerbaijan, well, if the money runs out and the people get restless again, I don't really fancy Aliyev's chances. There is Armenia's geopolitical advantage. That's their chance. That's your chance. To say to the world then, okay, we are positioned in a place where you need us. You've lost Afghanistan. You need to have some geopolitical base, a stable geopolitical base with a strong, educated young workforce, with a welcoming culture, and with a sort of, if you like, go-to attitude. That needs to be sold, though. We've heard this a few times over the last few hours. There is a message about Armenia that now needs to be sold, about the future. You can't. I have to be pragmatic. As an international government relations analyst, you can't solve these things overnight. They are a sort of progress. So in that way, I think we have to say, we are where we are, and if I'm honest, we may be there for a little while. Armenia has to work towards waiting its chance and pouncing when that chance comes. And I am convinced that chance will come as history develops and evolves in the short, in the medium to long-term future.
David, there have been very strong voices in the US that Azerbaijan should be brought within NATO. If that voice is listened to, and Azerbaijan enters NATO with Article 5, Armenia has an immediate problem, because it means that any suggestion of a defensive war, even that moves to offense, triggers Article 5 and the whole of NATO becomes involved. So Armenia is then locked in with no escape. She's got Turkey, potentially Azerbaijan, and then the whole of the NATO alliance effectively against her, and with nowhere to go. Now,
But that's exactly why Georgia didn't get into NATO, remember, Patrick?
Yes.
Because NATO saw what might happen and said, we don't want them.
But my concern is trying to, as an analyst, trying to think the unthinkable, because if one does not begin to think the unthinkable, the reason why Taliban won, and I'm thinking of a paper I wrote in 2009, which predicted they would win, was a doctrine of strategic patience. If that is applied, then we've got very real dilemmas. How do you deal with that?
I wouldn't necessarily share your analysis that it was a sort of a benign approach to the Taliban. I think we had a, how shall I put this politely, a creative role in it. And we created a monster that we then could not control. I think we'd probably have to agree that that's the reality of where we are with that. In terms of Azerbaijan joining NATO, that presupposes that Azerbaijan will stay as it is now. I don't actually see that happening. I think there will come a point where Azerbaijan will begin to implode. And when that happens, Armenia has to be ready. And that's work that has to start now, building up to it. Look at Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Qatar knew that at one day the Saudis and the Americans would not be able to work as effectively militarily, only militarily, as they used to do in the past. So that underground base in Saudi Arabia that the Americans spent billions of dollars on, which you and I probably know quite well, has been rendered useless. Qatar saw that might happen and started to make arrangements for a sort of an alternative military base and operational area for the United States. I think Armenia has to think along those lines. It's a horrible thing to say in the middle of a conference entitled International Freedom, Religious Freedom and Peace, but you know, we have to, peace doesn't just come about, does it? We often throw that word peace around. I'm not sure we all know what it means, really. We often say in the West we want peace and quiet. In 30 years of conflict resolution, I have never known peace to be quiet.
Thank you. I think with Tolstoy, the reason why you have war is to have the peace. You have a point here. Yes.
If we go back to history, the reason why the current problems exist is maybe we have to look at history, what happened in the 1918s and 20s. Back then, under pressure from Turkey, both Nakhichevan was given to Azerbaijan, and also the current Karabakh lands were given to Azerbaijan. Russia knew very well that these are Armenian lands, and yet they had to respect the Turks. Now, is there a relationship, you think, to the fact that the international community is not really reacting positively towards the war or towards the, towards the Armenian case, because the Russian or the Soviet borders are internationally considered as the real borders of these countries. And therefore, all the international community still thinks or agrees that these lands belong to Azerbaijan. Then no country has admitted or even talked about that these lands really belong to Armenia. We haven't been able to convince any country that Karabakh, even Nagorno-Karabakh, should belong to Armenia because they're all populated by Armenians. So do you think there is any relations between the reaction of the international community to these facts?
I think that's a very, very good question. The fact that the exact borders were unresolved the way in which the 91-92 war was perceived as in terms of Armenia's aggression to an occupying land which was not there, OSCE and others still wanting to discuss an ultimate settlement in terms of the borders. I think you've made a very, very real point, and I think the international community could still address the issue from that if it is recognized that there were those borders that existed. But look at it from a historic perspective and what constituted Armenia. Is there room for negotiation in terms of some redrawing of the map? What might that look like? It seems to me that this is an area that needs exploring much more, and it's a question of whether the Armenian government is interested in such a discussion. With Mr. Biden now in charge of the presidency of the US and Mr. Blinken, is there room for influencing them and a negotiation to be restarted together with the Russians on the border issues? I think those are the critical areas, and particularly in the light of Danny's point, who knows what might happen to Azerbaijan? Might she hold? Who knows what might happen to Erdogan? He's in massive financial problems. In other words, they're not as stable as they look at. The issues of oil, which so affected UK policy on BP's interest in Baku, could be shot under with a move towards electric cars. I think we are entering a very, very uncertain period. What I feel, and here I support Danny fully, the time is coming really to develop your three areas of strategy: the short term, mid-term, and long term. And perhaps this is an issue which tomorrow, if the foreign minister is here, are the kind of questions that should be posed. We are religious, humbly religious, and the political is another realm, but it is absolutely critical that this discussion takes place. Now, our time is up, but Armane had her hands up earlier. Could you come back, Armane, and then we will tie things up. Could you take the mic over there, please?
Thank you. So I have a question actually for Sheila, which in part follows on from her talk earlier and leads us into tomorrow's session, which is about...
Mike? Closer. Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I have a question for Sheila, which in part follows on from your talk, but also I think leads us on to tomorrow's topic, which is cultural preservation. And so the question is, who has standing at an international court against Azerbaijan's state-sponsored erasure of Armenian monuments? And I think this is in reference to what's happened in Nakhichevan, but also potentially in Karabakh. And so in other words, besides Armenia's government, who can legally raise these issues at international court?
Can you discuss that? I think the question is directed to you. Also raising the fact, why has not Armenia signed up to the international court? Could you?
If it's an international court, a criminal court, nobody has standing to raise the issue. Organizations can suggest to the prosecutor what, I mean, this is all theoretical because, like I said, neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan are parties to the ICC statute, which makes it just a non-starter. But there is some provision to potentially recognize the ICC's jurisdiction for a limited time period, even retroactively. That falls under Article 12 of the ICC statute, and that's up to, I mean, Palestine sort of did it. Then there's the added, question of whether Palestine is considered a state or not. And so, there's not enough time for me to really answer that question properly. There is some room for creativity, which is what I wanted my presentation to show, that you can get creative with what's available out there. The most the most realistic avenue for holding Azerbaijan to account for the destruction of cultural property is through the European Court of Human Rights. That's the way. That's the best way, and it's a way that I think can actually deliver real results, but it won't bring criminal liability. It's not a criminal path, it's a human rights path that can bring financial reparation and or even just satisfaction by the recognition that the violation of the human rights violation took place. Outside of that, there's the International Court of Justice, in which only governments have standing. And then it's a question of whether, like, which conventions are the governments, both governments have to be parties to these conventions. And Yerisha talked about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. Get creative by showing that there's a discrimination against Armenians by targeting their cultural property. Then you could possibly, that could form part of the case before the International Court of Justice. Then there's, there isn't much else other than if you do manage to qualify it as a war crime, a case can be built. Like, what's really, really important is the fact that evidence of this destruction is being collected right now. And one day it's going to form, I hope, part of cases before other national jurisdictions on the basis of what's called universal jurisdiction. So no perpetrator of any war crime anywhere in the world should get away with it. But it's just a question of who perseveres. And again, the will has to be political, because it does come from, except if you know, the Armenian Apostolic Church files a complaint before the European Court of Human Rights. But when it comes to international crimes, it doesn't initiate from the victim itself. It initiates from the prosecutor, the UN Security Council, or governments who will refer a case to the court. That's sort of how it works nowadays. I can't answer why Armenia hasn't signed on to the ICC statute beyond what I think is the reason. One of them is, obviously, once you do that, you expose yourself to scrutiny. And there was a war in which both parties fought, and you know, one hesitation that's very real, not just for Armenia, any government that signs on to the Rome Statute, is that they then become open to prosecution. And it's not governments, of course, it's individuals within the government. So it's quite an unpopular act unless there were crimes committed before, and then a new government comes into place, signs on so that they can hold past perpetrators accountable. That's usually how it goes. I'm a huge promoter of Armenia signing onto the ICC statute, because I don't care, like, whether you're Armenian or Azeri. If you committed a war crime, you need to be prosecuted for it. Like, that's just my position. I'm not going to distinguish between any ethnic group or whatnot. Nobody should be committing war crimes, and people who do should be punished. When you don't get on board with the international legal order in that sense, I always feel like it makes it look like you've got something to hide. But, you know, that's just coming from a human rights activist perspective. Politically speaking, I can understand that it might not be a strategically intelligent, or, you know, it might not be strategically good to do so, but I think it should be done nonetheless. I hope that answered the question.
I think it's a very, very important issue, and perhaps one which could be raised, Archbishop Viken, Your Eminence. I think that's a big issue. It's a moral issue, and one perhaps which the Church could give thought to. Our time has come to an end. He passed the message, but I think it's a very important point you've raised. I think I would agree with you 100%, and I think His Eminence could raise that point. I think the Church has a duty to take a moral stance on this. Criminal acts, torture is wrong, whoever does it, and therefore we must face up to that. So thank you all for your questions, and I trust you have found it a helpful day today. I think tomorrow will be very enlightening as we address the issues of artifacts. But conclude with one area. In some cultures, the worst thing you could do to a person is to eradicate their past, to eradicate their name. The old pharaohs used to do it of old. When one superseded the other, if they didn't like him, they made sure literally he disappeared from history. I think tomorrow's discussion is critical on that point. Some years ago, I was in eastern Turkey with a British Museum archaeologist, and she made the point to me as she was going around trying to catalogue the gravestones, etc. The Turks always got there, and they simply destroyed everything, so there was no memory of Armenia left. I have a library in England of over 2,500 Armenian books, which I've been collecting. And one of the reasons for that was I was in Beirut, went into a bookseller and asked him, were there any books on Christianity in the Middle East? He said, well, he had a lot, but someone came and bought all of them. I said, do you know anything about the person? He said it was a Muslim who did it, and the purpose was to destroy all records, particularly of Armenian history. And that led me to the point I'm going to start collecting. I now have 2,500, and many of them very, very rare. I think tomorrow is so critical. If the memory is removed, we have nothing left, and why we've got to address this critically. But let us remember that people are just as important, and crimes against them must also be on the agenda. So thank you all.